scholarly peer-reviewed article once because he had this greatest single line about multiple use I'd ever heard. It was simply, multiple use really means trying to eliminate your use to protect my use. And I think that worked about as well as anything I'd ever heard about the politics of it. And then finally, David Solom, manager, South Columbia Basin Irrigation District. So either come up, stay there, your choice, and we'll let you take the floor. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I'm Whelan with the Nature Conservancy. I want to thank Governor Mead and the Western Governors Association for inviting us to participate. I'm an Idaho guy. I've spent a 30-year career here working on natural resources, and I'm a generalist. I cover a range of issues, so I'm not an ESA specialist. But I want to take up the task given by Governor Mead at the Cody meeting, and that is to look for practical solutions to make the estates an authentic partner in species conservation and to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act. So I'm going to go through just a couple of quick slides and talk about some places and try to draw from them some of those best practices that I think have some value beyond Idaho. So most of you know the Nature Conservancy. We're now 60 years old. Nearly all of our work is focused on making conservation work for landowners and people who make their living from the land. Basically, we started out as a landowner. I think it's part of our DNA. And coming to the table with incentives that work for people to integrate conservation into their operations is what we do best. So the Conservancy supports the scientific framework and the congressional intent and purposes of the Endangered Species Act to protect and recover imperiled species. We do see a number of specific things that can be done to make the ESA work better, and in particular to draw on the expertise and the leadership of the state fish and wildlife agencies. The ideas I'm going to talk today are going to be focused on administrative actions. You know, congressional legislation's interesting. I think there are some things that the WGA could push at an administrative level that would bear some results. So the central challenge, I think we've heard a number of speakers talk about this today, is the number of species that are either listed or at risk that require ongoing conservation action. They are called the conservation reliant species by some people. That kind of conservation that requires years of effort and may involve complicated ecosystem interactions really requires a broader set of tools than the prohibitions under the ESA. And when you think about how you, particularly in the pre-listing environment, what's critical, what's important? For at-risk species, act early, act at an ecosystem level, involve and find a broad range of allies that can make conservation work. And critically, I think we heard the governor talk about this, others as well, be clear about the objectives. So we'd like to see focus by this effort and others to enhance the collaboration between federal and state agencies, to provide incentives to government agencies at all levels to conserve at-risk and candidate species before the need to list. So let me see if I can advance a slide. There we go. I'm going to start with a couple of stories and maybe extract from them some of the best practices. This landscape is in south central Idaho. This is the Pioneers landscape. It's sort of in that area around Craters of the Moon. It's a beautiful place. That's Cheryl Bennett worked for one of the ranches in the area. This is a collaborative effort called the Pioneers Alliance, along with some conservation groups, including the Nature Conservancy, the Wood River Land Trust, the Conservation Fund, the Idaho Conservation League, and a lot of local landowners. In this one landscape, 26 landowners have enrolled 38 ranches in conservation easements, initially through the Natural Resources Conservation Services Grassland Reserve Program, now through the Sage Grouse Initiative. So we've done about 70,000 acres of easements collectively in this area. There's another 13,000 in the pipeline and probably another few tens of thousands that we will try to get into the program. The outreach to the ranchers was outstanding here. The community leadership that came to the table with their objectives, talking to us about what they wanted to achieve, their commitment to ranching as a future in this landscape, and their readiness to commit to including grazing management plans compatible with sage grouse. That plus an extraordinary effort by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. These parcels that we're talking about here interlink a mix of ownerships. So this work actually helps connect elements of a 2.4 million acre landscape in this part of Idaho. Most of it is sage grouse habitat. Most of it's pretty resilient, relatively high elevation, and a rainfall pattern that works. This is November 2014. That's Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack giving the Pioneers Alliance the Lincoln Award. That's the highest honor for an external partner of the Department of Agriculture. This has been a tremendous effort. What's a best practice? You have under the Farm Bill a whole wide range of acronyms and programs. The Sage Grouse Initiative is an amazing program if we can target it and be effective with landowners. This is Sage Grouse Initiative 2.0. If you haven't seen this yet, take a look at it. NRCS is getting better at targeting SGI to specific objectives that they can talk about with landowners. The need to go out and take a look at our conservation programs across the board and align them with our species conservation needs is a great lesson in this landscape. This is the Pacimmeroy Valley. In the Upper Salmon. That's Glenn Elzinga. He's a ranch owner who did the first conservation project in his valley. That was, I'm going to say, 10 years ago. One of the funding sources for a project that got rid of a migration barrier on the Pacimmeroy was the Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Fund, Section 6 monies. It's a great source of voluntary incentives. Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund also worked. Another key lesson, again, building trust. Conservation on this ranch had to work for Glenn and Carol, and those are 7 of their 8 daughters. As a second phase of this project, we went on to a neighboring property in a separate project, but were able, thanks to that earlier project, to have his permission to close a crosscut ditch, which reconnected Big Springs Creek to the main stem Pacimmeroy. First year of that project produced 68 salmon Chinook reds into that stream. So in terms of best practices, this entire effort in the Upper Salmon is a collaborative among state and federal agencies. There's a science team that ranks the projects based on objectives that have been set and linked to a biological opinion with Bonneville Power and others. Michael Bogert mentioned the Nez Perce agreement earlier. That provides some of the funding. And there's an advisory council that involves landowners and gives them a sense of ownership and their understanding of our collective commitment to having ranching as part of the future in this valley. This is the L6 diversion. This was a multi-year effort. I guess it's still ongoing. We're working to provide 35 CFS, cubic feet per second of water at a key migration barrier. So that Chinook can get up to the upper Lemhi. Long story short, the solutions that we're working on are going to be implemented under Idaho State Water Law, local water master using agreements that take the flexibility in Idaho water law and make for a long-term solution for salmon passage in the system. So I'm going to wrap it up. I'll make one specific policy recommendation, a sort of the more wonky variety, in addition to building trust, being collaborative, thinking about what brings people to the table. There is a policy that I would commend to the Western Governors Association's consideration, and that is the Fish and Wildlife Service's policy on voluntary pre-listing conservation measures. This provides a broader range of assurances for people to take action before a species is listed, that they will get credit. It's not necessarily the same as a candidate conservation agreement with assurances or a safe harbor. It is a broader approach to giving credit for pre-listing conservation actions. It's an example of a policy that was received comment in the summer of 2014. It's currently stalled. It'd be a great thing for WGA to engage the partners in the agency and see if they can make that policy move. Thank you.
Well, I'll just sit here. This is like a reunion here, sitting between Brian and Will. I had the distinct honor, I guess, of with Virgil, of writing Governor Otter's sage grouse plan, and these two guys next to me were pretty integral to that. So they're probably gonna, sock me at some point in this discussion, but nevertheless, we're still friends, right? Yeah, so good. But to echo, to piggyback off of what the governor said, which really highlights, I think, a lot of very common sense, high level principles for engaging in the Endangered Species Act. That level of trust, collaboration, having a defined, as he said, not moving the whole football field. And that was one of the root core of our sage grouse plan. Was we stumbled on this little analogy. Maybe it was Brett Dumas who first talked about it, but he started talking about this sage grouse issue is kind of like a baseball field, and there are only a certain amount of premium seats behind home plate, and so who gets them? Who gets to mitigate for them? Who says, well, you don't get to go there because it's just too dang important. And we chewed on that analogy for quite some time. And I thought what was a real good turning point for that discussion was, well, how do you build more seats behind home plate? We want like the LA Rams new stadium. I mean, that thing looks pretty slick, right? We don't want it to, get beaten down to where you're only fighting over one or two. But what also happens too if something changes? And I think particularly with the Endangered Species Act, where you've seen this sort of evolution through time from a mortality-based statute, people over harvesting, to more, okay, what about land use plans, to now we're dealing with things like fire, climate change. And, I guess those folks who are debating that post-Paris, I guess, have to go down to the boiler room now to have that fight. I don't know. But anyway, it's sort of a different dynamic that we're dealing with now. And I think one of the things that we thought of is what we could use this sort of triage that Virgil talked about and zoning this species and saying, well, there can be a mechanism that both incentivizes folks to do the right thing, because there's a certain set of metrics that get you there to expand flexibility. But on the other hand, if some of these tougher threats like fire that are harder to get your arms around, there's a way to sort of make sure that there's enough in your savings account that the species remains at a viable level. And I think you can extrapolate from that principle to a lot of these other issues. And, I was really fortunate in my 10 years in the governor's office to work on two really big land use planning efforts with sage grouse, which is 15, 18 million acres in the state, and then Idaho roadless rule, which is another 9 million. So big chunk of land, any way you slice it. And one thing that I've come to figure out, if you look at the Endangered Species Act, and at some point it's good to brush that off and look at. But when Michael Bogert flashed up the definition of best available science, the secretary shall make listings solely on the best available science, he didn't catch the last part of that. In that same paragraph, right, it talks about the secretary shall provide consideration, take into account efforts being made by the state. So clearly when Congress set up this law, it recognized the inherent tension between state wildlife managers who have primary charge over the species, and then the federal government coming in and saying, well, things have gotten to a point that we need to course correct. And I think part of what has been difficult in incentivizing these private efforts, and I'll give you one quick example, the policy for evaluating conservation efforts. I thought Will was going there. I thought we were really sharing a mind there for a second, and I was getting really worried. But in that policy, just a quick example that evaluates voluntary efforts, and I think this is an area to really look at. We had a particular experience here in Idaho where the science behind a particular threat wasn't well defined. And often with the timeframes in the Endangered Species Act, that's the case. You've got this 90-day finding right up front, and then trying to make a decision. Gary's nodding his head because he's under the gun all the time on this thing. But it's difficult to make that snapshot judgment in time. And so how do you evaluate these conservation measures that are coming online, sometimes later than maybe they should, or, even at a reasonable time frame? How do you evaluate that? One of the issues we ran into is you had this lack of nexus between the alleged threat, the punishment fitting the crime, and the population of the species. And so these ranchers, in good faith, came forward, suite of conservation measures, and said, this is great. This is what we can come up with to help the species. Well, when it came to time to look at it from a peace perspective, and those folks evaluating, of course, are looking at the policy that they have in front of them, said, well, because on the certainty of effectiveness, we can't quantify that nexus. We can't give you credit under peace. And I thought, that's a curious statement, because if we can, back to best available science, if we can list based on the best available science, and sometimes there's gaps in that, everybody knows that, then why can't we credit the best available conservation measures with an eye toward adaptive management, that if it doesn't quite fit, doesn't quite work, and over time, how do we get from something that was voluntary, Brian, as a voluntary beginning, and somehow has proven track record over the years, becomes something more than just voluntary, that it's part of the actual analytical framework. And I think a big part of that driver, the deadlines in the Endangered Species Act are they're unreasonable. They're unrealistic to try to analyze a changing ecosystem in 30 days, a year, 2.5 years, especially when you put into the mix that most of these times you're talking about a threatened species. So trying to figure out, okay, you've got the foreseeable future, and looking at that window, which could be from 30 to 100 years, how do these efforts that we're trying to incentivize, how do you analyze those? I mean, certainly nobody has that great Noah's Ark ESA crystal ball, right? So how do we come up with a better way to analyze that issue? And maybe it's part of that lead-in to the Endangered Species Act, which says that the Secretary shall take into consideration state efforts. And maybe what the Western governors can look at is a mechanism to say, if the states have stepped up in one shape or form, that there's some sort of proving ground that gives you a couple of years test drive to see if this thing can work. Number one, that they're going to meet the commitments that are in the plan, and number two, that they work, before we start getting into these timeframes that just don't lend themselves to a collaborative process. And so I'll stop right there and let Brian contradict me and tell me I'm wrong. But anyway, those are a couple of the observations that came to my mind during today's discussion.
I'm not going to start by contradicting you, Tom. I will begin by saying that I think it's important to note, even though I have a little LLC, because when you do work for somebody, you have to. I retired 2 years ago from the Fish and Wildlife Service after several decades, 2.5 or so decades with the agency. And one of the things I didn't want to talk about today, Gary's running out of the room, which is very reassuring. That means I can talk about the agency. No, just kidding. I want to take a little different tack because I wrestled with this. Well, my normal MO is to come up here and tell you about what the agency does, how we can improve ourselves, and so on and so forth. I can't do that anymore, and I shouldn't. So I want to take a little different tack with my piece of this voluntary puzzle. And then maybe I'll answer Tom's question from my perspective. I wanted to look at the history of voluntary conservation and its importance. We've talked a lot about it today. I took notes from almost every panel, almost every speaker, hitting some of the things that are embedded in what I was going to say or stole my thunder to some degree, and I think were said better.
So maybe this is helpful in bringing some of it all together. It's not a new idea, voluntary conservation or collaborative work, okay? I'm not sure any of you think it is, but it's not. And I'm going to go through time just sequentially. And some of these events happened at very significant times in the history of conservation in the United States. And I think we're at another one right now. So a fellow by the name of Aldo Leopold, who I'm guessing many of you know who he is or was, after a long and, I suppose, I don't know the history well enough, distinguished career with what was then a new agency, the U.S. Forest Service. After he left the agency, he coined a term, land ethic. He realized, I'm going to read this to you, that after a career with the U.S. Forest Service, he realized that sustainable ecological and economic function of the land, ecological and economic, required the development of a community-based land ethic, that the agency work itself was not enough. That was right at a seminal time. Bill talked about the formation of WAFWA. Virgil, or the governor, talked about when the commission system went into effect in the state of Idaho. Right around that same time, Aldo said, wait a minute, agencies aren't going to be enough to do this. And it needed to be community-based. Then about 30 years later, right about the time ESA was passed, NEPA was passed, Earth Day, all of those things that happened in the 70s, late 60s, early mid 70s, a paper was published on adaptive management. And I don't know if you know the name of C.S. Holling, but he was actually in Canada at the time. He's now in Florida. So he came home, so to speak. Proposed this idea that we don't know enough about natural systems, how they work. They're highly variable. And to say that if we implement A, B is going to happen, we're really fooling ourselves if we actually know that. And he went one step further. And he says, so we need to really do it more in an experimental context. And those decisions that we make need to be made, and it's not in the Act, and I know Gary left on purpose. It's not in the Act because he wanted to talk about socioeconomic issues and political issues, that those decisions should be based not only on science, but socioeconomic and political considerations. A lot of what we talked about in some of the recommendations, the things, the examples that worked, you see those components involved, right? The Act doesn't permit that. And then I'm honored to call one of them a good friend, some folks at the University of Idaho, alma mater, published a paper probably within the last decade. I think the first paper came out, somebody may know, 96, 99, on this notion Will mentioned it, conservation-reliant species. And simply what they realized was if maybe the best way to define it is how they characterize it, that if you took every species listed under the Act at the time the paper was written, I think it was 86% of those species, post-delisting, would require ongoing conservation work. So this idea that the Act is going to solve everything is not the right paradigm to look at conservation in the long term. And they propose and look at, states was one of them, Tom. How do we leverage the state language in the ESA better? How do we set up conservation agreements? I think, Virgil, your work leading the WAFWA effort on sage grouse is huge in that regard, is an example of that. So anyway, there's a storied history here that seems to be occurring as a scientist at about a 20, 25-year cycle. And I think we're in one right now. So why do I share this? It's not new. Have we made progress? It's not for me to judge, but I think we have. When I listen to people talking here today and some of the work I was involved in, I see Brenda. This is actually, it is a reunion because I get to see people I worked with for many years, and I'm pleased to see them and say hi again. There are a variety of examples, and I don't know if it's going to be valuable for me to go through some. I'm going to go through some real quickly here if I have time. I look at Zach. Some what I think are components of success, okay? I don't want to talk into regulation and how that could change, but I'm going to answer Tom's question when I'm done, so keep me honest, Tom. I can't think of who said, I think Dan is one person I haven't been able to say hi to, but a good friend and somebody in the trenches on doing some good work in North Idaho. He said it really well. It's hard. It's really hard because at the core of it is trust. And if I have time, Zach's going to keep. I'll talk a little bit about caribou. I had to step out on your talk, Dan. But to get where we need to get, it's going to take work on both sides. This is stuff you've all heard. Some more specific things. For me, as a service employee, those decisions need to be as locally as I could make them in the Fish and Wildlife Service. With respect to Gary and his job in DC and the regional offices, I did my best to keep it local. Reward risk-taking by staff. Don't constrain them with what we used to do. Go find out what we should do. The first briefing, I'll tell this story, and Zach is going to throw a bottle of water at me or something, but maybe I'll end on this and I can move on, but unless I have more time. First briefing was, I'm not going to mention people's name, when I came to Idaho, came in, laid out the information for me and said, here it is. What do you want us to do? What do you want to do? And they had that was an anathema to them. And I said, you know the situation the best. You're working with the people on the ground. Go back and tell me what I said, okay, they took their papers and went home. So more time? Wrap it up? Okay, let me close on this. And I wouldn't take a lot more time, Zach. Two things. One, with respect to Dan and caribou, because it is relevant, and it's a good example. The trust issue is really important. And there were perceptions, valid, I think on both sides when we started this thing. And it took some hard work to come up there. And you coming down to my office and working locally to do what we did. And so I thank you for that on behalf of the resource. And with that, I'll end, Zach, so we can talk to questions.
Well, in the beginning, I have to note that Brian did a lot of that good work in Wyoming as well. It wasn't all done in Idaho, and we've always been appreciative of that. I'm going to try to address these issues in the context primarily of what we've done with sage grouse in Wyoming. And when the issue first came to the forefront, and I won't say that we were motivated, I might more truly say we being the citizenry of Wyoming were ordered by our then governor, and our current governor, Matt Mead, has followed up with that, to be responsive to this issue. So we tried to do so. From our perspective as an agricultural organization representing private landowners on the sage-grouse issue, the approach that we took is there isn't a one-size-fits-all. So we want to work with every program we can evolve that will assist or provide opportunity for landowners in the state to engage in this recovery effort for the sage grouse. Fortunately, it was an iconic species that most landowners have some appreciation for. So I wouldn't pretend that if we were talking grizzly bears or wolves, that these strategies would necessarily work. But that process for us, and I'll go through 3 or 4 of these in order to illustrate not only what we've done, but more importantly, some of the challenges we faced, began with an effort to have a statewide candidate conservation agreement with assurances for sage grouse. And some of the problems were the state first undertook the challenge of developing the statewide framework agreement. That went on for, I believe, close to 4 years without success, culminated in nothing. Fortunately, Fish and Wildlife at the state level stepped in and said, well, we'll do, the state one was going to be for all uses of the land. Fish and Wildlife said, we'll take a little more realistic approach and work on a prototype candidate conservation agreement for livestock grazing. They were successful with that. They engaged all of us in that process in what it needed in order to work. And the outcome was a statewide candidate conservation agreement for sage grouse. We've taken a primary role in informing the landowners in the state on the opportunities that this provided, recognizing that it wasn't for all people, recognizing, be very honest about the fact that for many landowners, signing an agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service is akin to signing an agreement with the devil. But be that as it may, I think we have some success to show for it. So after about 2 years with the Canada Conservation Agreement, I'm sure, I don't know if you can all see the map there, but the dark blotches on there represent private land candidate conservation agreements that have been completed in the state. Of those to date, there are 41 of them, totaling 515,000 acres roughly. The yellow ones that are a little more concentrated, but some a little larger, represent Canada conservation agreements without the second A, the assurances that landowner or that grazing permittees are able to enter into with regard to their public lands that they graze on. To date, we have 23 of those in place, representing roughly 868,000 acres. So once there was an understanding of those, what the potential was, the fact that they were not perpetually binding, that the landowner could with 30 days notice withdraw from one at any point in time. Those were all factors in building some confidence. Right now, the jury's out with us since the decision that listing was not warranted, whether landowners will continue that level of interest in the spirit of that being a good tool to recover the species or not. And I'll address that a little more later in the context of a couple of other things. I believe that Tom mentioned, or someone did, the NRCS Sage Grouse Initiative. That's been another tool that we've supported, been important in Wyoming. Our organization has an affiliated land trust. We've been able to do some significant conservation easements to provide permanent protection for sage grouse habitat using some of that funding from the NRCS. The latest efforts have focused on creating credits for sage grouse conservation, which can serve to meet the needs in our state, particularly of the energy industry, that can have significant impacts. And unlike in Idaho, where fire is the major threat, in Wyoming, land fragmentation was deemed to be the most significant threat. So compensating for that became critical. So several things have happened in that context. We've got one established conservation bank in Wyoming, currently about 35,000 acres, that has credits available to sell to entities that need to purchase credits to cover their impacts. And our role in that is that our land trust will hold the conservation easement on those lands as those credits are purchased. We have two other, I believe, conservation banks that are in the formative stage right now, involving some significant land holdings. For our part, we've collaborated with a number of interests to develop a conservation exchange. And at least for practical purposes, a little bit the distinction there is the bank is usually a single landowner who's offering to do a conservation easement most typically. The vision that we have for this exchange is it would be available to any landowner to participate that is operating in habitat that is critical to sage grouse. And the practices could range from permanent protection through easements to management changes, conservation practices that would benefit the sage grouse and would be assured to continue for the time period of the debits on the other side that they were sold to provide protection for. We're still moving forward with that. Just some of the challenges we face there that I think are been a lesson to us, and I might mention before that, speaking of collaboration, that has involved the University of Wyoming, the Nature Conservancy, our conservation districts, Environmental Defense Fund, the energy industry, as well as our own organization. So it's truly a collaborative effort. We're very near now being at the point that we're able to roll that out. But one of the huge challenges, and this is something I think we need to address in all of this, is that we've had Fish and Wildlife obviously plays a critical role. They have to give their blessing to the exchange, and that is so critical because with that blessing, then it simplifies the process that every individual landowner participation doesn't have to go back for regulatory approval because the exchange itself has that approval. But Fish and Wildlife is a key player in this. They've cooperated very well with us. The state of Wyoming has stepped in a major way and developed their own framework for credits and debits for sage grouse. And those are not necessarily consistent. And now we're dealing with the BLM, who's a critical player in this, and they haven't yet decided whether they're going to buy the system that the state has developed. So we've got at least three key entities there. Our challenge and our frustration has been that trying to satisfy all three. And I think that points to one of the needs here, and that is to promote some consistency and approaches among all the involved agencies on these types of actions. And finally, the last thing that we're now involved in addition to the exchange, is working with an organization. And if we could, am I doing the slides or are you? Not sure.
Right hand.
Right hand. Okay. Went too far. And this is a multi-state effort. You'll see a number of just logos up there of agricultural organizations from California, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, et cetera, working together to build a database of acreages that would be available for conservation credits. And landowners can sign up their acreages to make those available. It allows us to offer a package to say, as an example, an energy company that's building a transmission line that may traverse several states and is in need of credits to compensate for their impacts, instead of having to deal with multiple individual landowners, that they can deal with one entity. We're working with Keiko Conservation Services on this. To date, we have 2.7 million acres enrolled across 7 states, and most of this is within core sage-grouse habitat. Again, nothing completed yet, but we believe another opportunity and a lot of potential. Private landowners play a critical role in all of this, and I know the next panel will address that a little more, but from our experience, just 3 or 4 things that from the landowner perspective, I think are essential that we be able to provide them. First is regulatory certainty. The second is clear recovery goals, so they know that it's not an ever-moving target, as has been talked about earlier. The third is, of course, the opportunity for financial return. The fourth, since in Wyoming and many of our western states, the use of public lands in ranching operation is so integral to the use of the private lands, I believe it's essential that we develop some mechanisms where we can provide some permit security to landowners who are engaging in these various conservation practices, specifically geared to the benefit of a species. Finally, in terms of, and that is the acreages there, just to call it to your attention, that have been signed up in that program to date. What do we need to change in this whole process? I would offer a few things. One, we're overwhelmed by the complexity. I believe that the CCAs, CCAs can play an important role. And what I would hope is that we can identify a process that would simplify and expedite the creation of statewide candidate conservation agreements by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The time frame just drags on too long. The second, and I referenced this a little earlier, the credit debit structures that are being developed by the state, by one federal agency, by a federal land agency. We need some consistency there. We need some methodology, so those of us that are trying to work from the private sector in this field can have a clear set of criteria that we have to meet, and not wonder if we're going to have to meet one set on public lands because of BLM or Forest Service, and another set on perhaps state lands because of the state role, or on private lands because of the state role, and then all of that, of course, having to satisfy the needs of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Another major concern that we've had, there seems to be a reluctance to this point on the part of the federal agencies to allow practices to garner regulatory relief and financial return simultaneously. And the good example, the Candidate Conservation Agreement provides the regulatory relief. An incidental take permit that is protection if the species is to be listed. To date, there's been a real reluctance to go the next step and say, well, that same practice, if it's implemented appropriately, can be eligible for credits for a financial return to the landowner. From our perspective, that just doesn't make sense. First, it's not double dipping. One's regulatory protection, the other's financial protection. Second, often the landowner needs that financial ability in order to proceed with the types of practices that will also garner for them the regulatory relief. So we would like to see a mechanism developed so that for the right types of qualifying practices, regulatory relief and financial incentives can work as a team to maximize the willingness of landowners to enter into and participate in these. And finally, my last point in terms of some change, I think Tom covered this well, and this is the one that probably would necessarily need some congressional action with the ESA, and that is that in the listing process, It envisions a petition, the gathering of information, good science, and a decision. There's nowhere within that process that it allows for a time frame or encourages the development of state engagement, of collaborative efforts, such as what we've seen with the sage grouse in the western states. And as I mentioned in one of our breakout groups, the reason we were able to do that with the sage grouse was we had a decision that listing was not warranted. We had litigation challenging that decision. We then had a warranted but precluded decision. That whole time frame until the final decision now not to list provided some, I think, roughly 8 years for collaborative efforts to take place, for states to take the initiative and move forward. I'm not saying we can always have 8 years, but somewhere in that mechanism that leads from a petition to the listing of a species, there needs to be a time frame and an encouragement in the law itself for these types of collaborative efforts, state-led, locally led, with all interests coming together to be able to function, which they simply can't do today. With that, I again thank you for the opportunity.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide a perspective of water users. I greatly appreciate the work of the Western Governors Association and its attention to the Endangered Species Act. My name is Dave Solom. I'm the manager of South Columbia Basin Irrigation District in Washington. Prior to my tenure at South District, I was the manager at Klamath Irrigation District in Oregon. I offer my comments today on behalf of water users throughout the West. I'm the current president of the Washington State Water Resources Association and a board member for the National Water Resources Association. I also co-chair the NWRA Environmental Task Force, which examines issues associated with ESA. At its leadership conference last week, NWRA identified issues associated with ESA as one of its top priorities. NWRA also works with the NESARC, the National Endangered Species Reform Coalition, and the Family Farm Alliance. The Endangered Species Act, while well-intentioned, has produced restrictive and litigation-oriented regulatory mechanisms that often do too little to recover species. The ESA can directly impact operations of Western water suppliers, and in some instances can lead to drastic reductions in supply. The benefits of pre-listing conservation efforts are numerous. They engage people that know the local landscape and have experience working the land, in many cases, many generations back. States can be valuable partners in providing support for voluntary conservation efforts. State engagement can be especially important when Western water issues are involved. The protection of state allocated water rights is of utmost importance and must be respected. We have some success stories. In New Mexico, the Elephant Butte Irrigation District spent 15 years developing the Environmental Water Transaction Program. This program enables the acquisition of water from Elephant Butte through voluntary transactions to develop habitat sites for the Southwest willow flycatcher along the Rio Grande. It provides market-based solutions where the federal government and the environmental community buy into the existing allocated water rights system. The Upper Colorado River Endangered Species Fish Recovery Program was initiated in 1988 to avoid conflicts between water development and protection of 4 ESA-listed fish. To date, no lawsuits have been filed on ESA compliance, and no water has been taken from any water user or reclamation contractor to provide water for endangered fish. The status of the listed fish has improved, with downlisting being considered. Water managers have found the flexibility to make this work. There is great value in state and local conservation efforts. This does not mean that efforts are not without challenges. Two of the greatest impediments to these efforts are trying to address a moving target and the threat of litigation. In the Klamath Basin, Since the 1988 listing of Lost River and short-nosed suckers, a dam has been removed, a $12 million fish screen has been constructed, a fish ladder designed specifically for suckers was constructed on another dam, thousands of acres of farmland were flooded after levees were blown up, lake levels were restricted, resulting in a complete shutoff of the Klamath Project in 2001, and millions of dollars have been spent for biological opinion, reasonable and prudent alternative and conservation measure implementation. Even after all of that, it is now estimated that successful recovery will cost an additional $135 million and take another 30 to 50 years. In the Deschutes Basin, irrigation districts have implemented almost 90 conservation projects aimed at increasing water delivery efficiency and improving habitat conditions. These efforts have returned 50,000 acre-feet of water per year to the river at a cost of approximately $75 million. Despite these efforts, an environmental group filed litigation in December against the Bureau of Reclamation regarding reservoir operations in the basin and the Oregon spotted frog. As Governor Otter and others have commented, certainly without an end game, voluntary and ESA directed conservation efforts will continue to be a challenge. In conclusion, NWRI believes that ESA should be modernized and require that the appropriate federal agency provide detailed recovery plans at the time of listing. The recovery plan should identify such items as recovery activities, recovery cost and time frame, and recovery probabilities, economic impacts of listing, and the scope of Section 7 consultations. The ESA should be amended to permit Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries to approve conservation plans for species in advance of listing, and would commit to issue a permit upon any subsequent listing. Plan modifications would require permittee consent. Species and critical habitat designation decisions and adverse impact findings must be firmly proven and based on reasonable data and scientific evidence, which includes an evaluation of the present and foreseeable sociological and economic impacts. In relation to WGA's efforts, we also believe that states have a vital role to play in the implementation of the ESA. The federal agency should be more open to state-sponsored ESA conservation efforts. We also encourage WGA's members to discuss litigation reform with their federal counterparts. Too often, collaborative conservation efforts are sidelined by litigation. Again, thank you for listening to a water user perspective.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes till our break, so let's ask some questions. Maybe the elephant in the room question, maybe not the best way to phrase it, but I'll do it anyway for all of you. Do you see the ESA as a necessary motivator to ensure meaningful and effective voluntary conservation efforts? In other words, no ESA, does this happen? You're looking at me.
That was my mistake.
You want to try that one? I mean, do we need it?
Well, I'll jump in. Or go ahead. Go for it. Save me.
I think it is. I'll just leave it at that. I think that's where it works the best in my experience working with the agency. I used to start presentations that I would give when I worked for the agency with the service mission, Gary, and it doesn't say our job is to list species. It's one of the things we do. Our job is to conserve wildlife and plants and fish for the American people. Listing is one thing we do. And if the act is a motivator that prohibits listing, I think that's how we would prefer to see it done.
I might just add that I do see it as a necessary motivator, but I would say that with some changes, it can be a more effective motivator, and it certainly isn't the only motivator. But it should be a part of that suite of motivators that's out there.
I think I'll agree with the Wyoming Stock Growers. Yeah, I've been watching these species issues for 30 years, and I'm sort of tempted to ask for a show of hands, but I won't. Who agrees that the ESA is a motivator?
They did it anyway, Will.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of reading the thought bubbles above your heads. It's maybe not as politically correct. I've watched a lot of species conservation efforts without at-risk species being considered for ESA listing, and then watch them when the species issue comes on, and the level of participation, the level of investment, and the seriousness goes way up. That said, it's at least my preference that we avoid the listing. It's a safety net. I think in these days, with the kind of sophistication and collaboration that we have in this room, that we have better tools, more flexible tools if we act earlier than the listing and not rely on things like Section 9, which is the prohibition on take. It's a very blunt tool. So I think of it as a motivator. I'd rather be dealing with people who are not experiencing extremely high levels of adrenaline, however. I'm looking at Tom for some reason. I think a collaborative approach in the cool of the day to deal with these issues early tends to produce the best results.
I guess I should say something. One of the things, if you look at the purpose of the Endangered Species Act, it talks about that the Secretary shall take steps as may be appropriate. And I think one thing that we have to be careful of, whether it's a motivator, a driver, whether it's now you've sort of seen this integration between federal land use planning and the Endangered Species Act. I mean, I found that study by the Defenders of Wildlife interesting lately that said that Section 7 really hasn't stopped many projects. Well, is that because of the threat of Section 7, threat of litigation? Is it the land use planning over time has caught up to that? I don't know. There's a million reasons. But the thing I would point out is, especially when you have these dynamic ecosystems that we talked about before, like fire, for example, really hard to control. You try to do your best on this sort of thing, but that we don't have a threat misalignment with the measures that we take. And what I mean by that is, well, as land managers, we can only control grazing or mining, even though in Idaho, those don't amount to a whole lot for a lot of these species. You could take them all off, you could remove all the mining, you could take away all the oil and gas, but if you can't control fire and invasive species, the species isn't going to hang around much. So we got to be very careful that we take prudent measures, which I think in large measure with the governor's sage grouse team we did, that we don't get out ahead of what the actual science says about those threats for that particular area.
Well, we can't forget that ESA also sometimes is a motivator for the federal agencies to do their job. A lot of litigation is directed at them for failure to consult or that the listing is not happened in an appropriate amount of time. So it kind of works both ways. I think sometimes we just think that it's the land manager or the person, people, the ranchers, the water user on the land that it's motivation for. But I think it goes across the board and everybody has to take a look at it.
Okay, the next question is asking Congress to do something. So take that with a grain of salt. And it's controversial, but nonetheless, it needs to be asked. It's been talked about. Would you support a repeal of the citizen suit provision of ESA in favor of mediation or arbitration? You want to take that one on? See, you get Congress involved.
Hey, I'm not the Endangered Species Act. It's a different one. I guess I'll take a shot, John.
Sure.
Probably a repeal globally. setting aside all the realities of this hypothetical, right? In some instances, I think it would work. Listing up or down, that's probably pretty tough, to sit down and try to mediate that with somebody. But I could see certain situations, maybe over critical habitat, maybe over a Section 7, a particular project, where you may be able to use that tool. I mean, I was involved in a mediation, a court-ordered mediation with Greater Yellowstone grizzly bears delisting, and oh my goodness, it was a very illuminating conversation. I think that what would have had to have happened in the front end is there had to have been a lot more conversation leading up to the settlement between the parties. As these two guys know, when you're trying to hammer out something like this, you got to spend a lot of time eating out of the sage stop over there in Mountain Home to build that relationship to try and settle that. Where in that situation, it was, okay, judge, everybody getting together, people who had never even talked to each other, or, that's a really hard, environment. But I do see there's instances, there's areas in the ESA that I think, that may be worth looking at, setting aside the reality.
Sure, get it.
So the Conservancy doesn't litigate, so this is not of immediate concern to us, but in a prior life for the state of Idaho, I've done court-ordered mediation. That's some fairly extensive court-ordered mediation on tough issues, and it can work. You want to be thoughtful about how you approach it. Arbitration tends to be most effective where you have two parties who have essentially a money dispute, or it's a fairly, it's a dispute fairly specific to the two parties, and it's kind of resolvable by splitting a baby. It's harder to do arbitration where you're interpreting the laws of the nation. That's kind of something we've entrusted to the Article 3 courts. So I see a difference between sort of the alternative dispute resolution side of that question and the arbitration side.
Okay, great.
I would just say that I've been involved in court-ordered mediation that lasted 13 years. And so it isn't a quick process. It can go on and on. It kind of depends on the administration at the particular time, whether they're more in favor of settling or more in favor of going to court and actually to trial. So it's not necessarily, an alternative that gets you where you want to be in any short period of time.
I think the question really has two parts to it. Certainly there's a role for mediation. I think not arbitration so much, but mediation. As far as the citizen suit provisions, mediation isn't a complete substitute for those. I do feel strongly that the citizen suit provisions need to be tightened up so that they work more effectively, more efficiently, so that those bringing the suits have a greater responsibility under those suits. So that's a separate issue, though, from the role of mediation.
Well, we got 10 minutes. I want to make sure we get questions from you folks. Are there some people with the mics? Anybody want to put their hand up? Got a hand up over here. We'll get as many as we can. We do have a little bit, not too much time, but a little bit.
All we are saying is let's give peace a chance. Tom, this is for you. You talked about the peace documentation about, the policy for evaluating conservation actions and both sides of it. Could you elaborate a little bit more on your thought about conservation actions being considered as part of that are in the development stage, even though we don't have the clear-cut science supporting that action? Well, Terry Mesmer, Utah State.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and maybe Brian and Gary will correct me on this, but I mean, I think peace was largely an outgrowth of some of those ESA cases that said in very shorthand, you can't put a listing or delisting on a credit card. You got to have some sort of analysis to prove that these measures that come along are going to be effective, that they're going to be implemented. what we found in the case that the specific case that I was talking about is it was a very I thought it was a very narrow approach, and admittedly, I think this was one of the first cases where peace had been used to preclude a listing or withdraw a prior decision. So very early in the stages, so you learn a lot about that. But what I found interesting from the agency's perspective as they analyzed it is they were looking at these very discrete individual measures rather than looking at the totality of the plan. And I think that was a point that Virgil had made earlier, whether it's a threat base or whether it's an outcome base. And what we tried really hard to do with our sage grouse plan, for example, is try to integrate both of them. At first, there was a discussion of just lock up a bunch of habitat and that'll solve the problem. And I said, no, that ain't gonna fly. We got to find something else. So we found a way through those zones to say, what are our targets? What are we trying to achieve? I think going back in the DeLorean, if we would have had to do it all over again, we would have incorporated those sort of targets up, objectively driven measures. And I think maybe that would have helped the Fish and Wildlife Service put in context, because I remember distinctly one of the criticisms of the plan was, well, you can't demonstrate effectiveness for this particular management area for fire because you haven't had a fire. Well, do I need to go set a fire so you can prove? I mean, it was a very chicken or the egg sort of thing. And I think that policy for incentivizing, especially, as the program notes, about keeping things off the list, should really be go take another look at it and see if we can better incorporate some of those principles, keep with those principles, but find a way to make it so folks will be more willing to engage in those type of efforts.
Anybody else? I think we've got time for, looks like a hand there. One more.
I guess I'd say this to elicit response, but I think it would be interesting to note as far as whether or not the ESA is a motivator, is that WAFWA determined sage grouse to be a species of conservation concern in 1954. And so response as to whether or not the ESA worked as a motivator to get us to a plan.
They're nodding. Okay, well, let's do this then. Moderator's priority here, prerogative. It's break time. We're going to take about a 15-minute break, then come back for our last workshop, which is on private land incentives for folks like that, which ought to be pretty interesting.